Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. Good evening. Everyone is welcome in the room. Everyone who may be on the Zoom, if we're Zoom connected, yes, is welcome here this evening as well. My name is Ronnie Weatherup. I'm the president of the Belfast Charitable Society, and you're welcome to this splendid building this evening for another one of our talks. Now, a few housekeeping measures I have to mention. First of all, there'll be no fire alarms planned today, and if you hear one, it's probably the real thing. So if you could follow the instructions which you may be given by the staff members who are sitting here and who will call your attention to what needs to be done. For those who wish to go to the bathrooms, they're on the right outside the door. And if I could remind you to switch off your phone so that there's no interruption. For those online, if I may address you, it's to say that you will be muted throughout the evening. Please ensure that your camera is switched off, and you can use the chat function. So if there are questions at the end and you wish to pose that question, please do so on the chat line. I'll monitor the questions at the end, and our speaker will give his usual accomplished answer to whatever you may throw at him. The other thing I may mention is that tonight's event is being recorded, so just so that you're aware of that. Now, the Charitable Society is celebrating 250 years since this building opened in 1774. It was established by an act of the Irish Parliament in that year, and it was incorporated so that it could act as a charity and receive money and hold money in perpetuity. And it has continued in that capacity ever since. And this is one of the oldest working buildings. It is the oldest in Belfast. Other buildings at the time, developed at the time, unfortunately, are no longer with us for the most part, but there are one or two. We continue, however, to operate here to serve those who are disadvantaged. And North Belfast is one of the poorest wards in Northern Ireland, and there is much deprivation and disadvantage in this area. And the Charitable Society seeks to do what it can to alleviate that with our valuable staff and volunteers. And during this year, we've had a series of talks. We've had legacy issues that have arisen. We've had tours, we've had conferences dealing with a variety of issues. We've had exhibitions, and we've had open days, and I hope you've had the opportunity to come to some of them in the past, and there will be more to come. Now, the Society has a strong history of adapting itself to all the needs of the times and to the changing disadvantages that emerge from time to time. And just as we sought to address the needs of 1774, when of course the social system that we now have was absent, nevertheless, we still seek to ask the same question, and that is, what can this society and what can you as members and supporters of it do to address disadvantage today? Because it is of a different character to that which prevailed in 1774, but it's no less important that those who are less advantaged than the rest of us should have such support as we can provide for them. Now, one example of that is that in recent times, you will be aware that school meals have been discontinued in holiday times. And this is has a big impact on a lot of families. And food poverty is a significant issue, especially in disadvantaged areas such as this. The Charitable Society funds the holiday school meals programs for 12,000 children in this region. Just think of the scale of that. 12,000 meals are provided to those who would otherwise qualify were the statutory scheme to be extended to holiday times. That's how many children are receiving those support from day to day. The Charitable Society supports them outside those times. And the cost of that, of course, is very substantial and depends upon voluntary contributions, because this society does not receive public funding. It is dependent upon voluntary donations. And this year we are trying to make new contacts, receive new donations, reach out further than we have done in the past, and engage with new people, all with the purpose of securing additional funding where we can find it. Now, this talk is one of the means by which we do that, and we're grateful to all of you who've provided your support this evening. You're going to hear about something I don't suppose you thought you would come to a lecture for, but I'm glad to see there's such a good turnout. Body snatching is going to be the subject of this evening. Clifton Street Cemetery, you may be, or may not be aware of, but it's at the back of this building. Originally, when this building was completed, there were 19 acres altogether, extending from here, North Queen Street, up to Antrim Road and across Clifton Street. So it was quite a large area, and they devoted the part which is immediately before the Antrim Road as a graveyard at that time. The existing graveyards were one in Corporation Street, where St George's is, and that graveyard's still there, although it's not been used for a long time. Secondly, at Shankle, which is the oldest church in Belfast, Sean Kill being an old church, and there's a graveyard there, although the church is long gone. And then the graveyard is opened here, promoted because in 1800 they closed the St George's graveyard because of the sea washing in over the graveyard, with the consequences you might expect. So it wasn't suitable any longer, and the graveyard opened here. And we will hear more about how that operated. Now, our speaker is James Crummy, and he is, those of you who've been here before will know, he's the archive coordinator for the North Belfast Heritage Cluster and the Great Places, which is of which this building is a part. There are 16 buildings altogether which are being restored or renovated or promoted, and they include a number of buildings which are designed to serve the community and rehabilitate the area, and it's being done through the promotion of these buildings. So we've got a former synagogue, a former Presbyterian church with this building, with the cathedral area, we have the Catholic Church here, and we have the church halls on the Antrim Road, and we have the Orange Hall behind in Carlisle Circus, and we have the former church there beside it. So all of these buildings, and the Working Men's Club up on the Antrim Road, all of these buildings you'll see probably in a list of that you have in that booklet there, are all part of this cluster. James works with that, and he has a background in archaeology, geography, and history. And he has completed works. I was impressed by this, Victorian mental health asylums in Britain. Well, I don't know if he's published anything about that, but that no doubt is a valuable work. Even more exciting, maybe, witch trials in Europe. And he's just told me something about an unexpected story, or a surprising story, about witch trials in Norway. So his work has focused on the historical side, the cluster, and the work that's going on there. And this building and the graveyard are part of our history. Not only are you going to hear about the body snatching, but you're going to hear a little bit more, I think, about the use of the graveyard, the body snatchers, and the watchmen who looked out for what was going on in the graveyard in former times. So, without further ado, James, please come and tell us about body snatching.
Welcome. This research on this rather bizarre topic, as Tony said, was conducted as part of my role as archive coordinator of the North Belfast Heritage Cluster. The leaflets that we've left on your seats showcase all the members of the cluster. If you do enjoy this talk, the website will take you to more research that has been done over the past couple of weeks. Some of our recent research focuses on the unsuccessful assassination attempt on one of the area's most prolific benefactors. If anyone's familiar with Glenravell Street, it was the unsuccessful assassination attempt on Edward Benn. Likewise, we are telling the stories of many World War soldiers associated with cluster members, and indeed a story of an old biscuit factory on the corner of Donegal Street and Carrot Hill that many of you will have passed on your way here tonight. So, over the next 40 minutes or so, we are going to revisit one of the stranger topics in recent history, body snatching, and looking at how such a macabre practice came to thrive in the early decades of the 19th century. I'll try to keep the talk quite light and upbeat, which, given the subject matter, is actually easier than you may think. But first, I want to take you back to Belfast, where science was really struggling to find a universal foothold, where it was seen as the domain of the rich and the elite. To a small town where the poorhouse, where many of you sit today, was really on the outskirts of the city. A Belfast before City Hall and before the cathedral. A different era with different ways of life, different fashions, different habits, and different challenges. One of these challenges was, as we're about to see, people stealing other people's deceased relatives. I want to start this talk by asking a rhetorical question to you all. What do these two individuals have in common? The man on your right is Spencer Perceval, and the woman on your left is Mary Shelley. We'll come to Mary Shelley in good time, as if she's a woman that requires any introduction to many. On the other hand, many of you may not have heard of Spencer Perceval. Well, he was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom between 1809 and 1812. He is also one of the best answers to impress your friends and family in any upcoming pub quiz questions. So, if you take nothing else away from this talk, it is that Spencer Perceval is the only British Prime Minister to be assassinated while in office. So, what do these two people have in common? I believe the answer is this man, John Bellingham. Now, Bellingham was a sailor and a merchant. He is also what those in the scientific community would call a walking disaster. As a sailor, he was midshipman on a ship called the Hartwell, which set sail from Kent en route to China. On the voyage, there was a mutiny and a ship ran aground and sank off the coast of Africa. When he returned to London, he tried his luck establishing a tin factory, which too was a massive failure. We catch up with him in Russia, where he was on another ship, having not learned his lesson the first time. It too sank, but this time he was accused of sabotaging it. He was then imprisoned in Russia for 6 years. On returning to Britain, he was intent on claiming compensation that he felt he was owed by the government for his wrongful imprisonment. He continued to push for this compensation for a further 3 years until 1812. After a visit, a civil servant reportedly told him he was at liberty to take whatever measures he thought proper to receive the compensation he felt he was owed. So he did what any rational person would do and promptly purchased 2 pistols at a gunsmith and got a tailor to sew concealed holsters into his coat. As the story goes, on Monday the 11th of May, 1812, Bellingham took a friend's family to an exhibition before remarking that he simply had other business to attend to. He then made his way to Parliament, where he waited in the lobby. When Prime Minister Perceval appeared, Bellingham stepped forward and shot him in the heart, before calmly sitting down on a nearby bench and awaiting his arrest. When tried in the Old Bailey, Bellingham said he would have preferred to shoot the British ambassador to Russia, but insisted he was justified in killing the representatives of those who had wronged him. He was found guilty and given a public hanging 3 days later. Now, why did I start a talk about body snatching with a very much alive man? Well, as you can see in this commemorative plaque on his place of birth, the tone of the time is ever so slightly off in how we remember it. This man assassinated a prime minister and was perhaps one of the most severe form of politically motivated civil unrest that we have seen, which is ironic, speaking from Belfast. But for those of you who can't quite see, the plaque simply says, "A failed businessman who blamed the government for his problems." Now, given the fact that this man had killed the Prime Minister, it's quite interesting that it is reported as if it is a throwaway line from a Blackadder sketch. So, we can already see that the tone surrounding body snatching and how it is retold is a little bit odd. But more importantly, I'm telling you the story of John Bellingham because he was the exact sort of person who ended up on the dissection table in a medical school in Britain at that time. The only bodies that were able to be dissected during the 19th century were the bodies of convicted criminals, whose dissection was ordered by the courts. These were usually murderers. This was quite interesting because it was due to the fact that dissections were seen as a fairly heinous practice and was widely condemned by religious leaders, with some of them going as far as calling it a pagan practice. This was because, according to religious teachings, the body was seen as a religious symbol in of itself. The idea that we were made in God's own image led many to frown upon an act that deliberately defiled the body, such as dissection or autopsy, particularly as it was perceived that the only reason for dissection was to sate academic curiosity. This, rather conveniently, made it suitable for further punishment that could be levied against the worst criminals society had to offer. As it was so reviled by the church, ordering a body to be dissected after execution could be classed as punishment not only in this life, the execution, and the next. These executions, and sometimes the dissections, were a great public spectacle, attracting thousands of locals. You can see in the rightmost image the depiction of the execution of William Burke, a name many of you may be familiar with, and we will come to him in due time. Being executed in a public forum with crowds looking on. And I just want to quickly bring attention to the skull. That is the actual skull of John Bellingham. He was dissected in Bart's in London, and they just kind of kept it. But it most recently made the news because archaeologists using computer-generated imagery recreated what they thought he would look like based on the osteoarchaeological results, which is pretty accurate. Now, relying on bodies from executions caused a significant limit in the number of bodies available. Particularly due to the Napoleonic Wars, the demand for doctors was on the rise. At the same time, the number of executions were in decline. Relying wholly on this one limited source meant that there were not enough bodies for students to dissect, and dissection of a human body was seen as a rite of passage for any medical student becoming a doctor, and it was necessary for them to complete their training. Dissections were also the best way at the time of improving understanding of anatomy, disease, and the human body. This too was heavily impacted by the single stream of bodies available, as they largely came from a single demographic, namely males in their early 20s to late 40s, who, until hours earlier, were largely in good health. There wasn't much information to be gleaned from healthy bodies beyond the impact of the hangman's noose, as any chronic or long-term health conditions, such as heart disease, cancer, or organ failure, had not had the opportunity to reach a stage to which it would become fatal. The single supply of bodies from courts and gallows were now drastically outstripped by demand, and there was an increasing desire to diversify the types of bodies in the name of science. So, some very industrious individuals went off in search of their own. Knowing that there was money to be made in doing the legwork and retrieving the freshly deceased, people began digging up the recently buried to sell to the good doctors. There are many different ways in which they supposedly carried out these ghoulish tasks. Sometimes it was as simple as bribing the gravekeepers, who could provide access and point out the fresh graves. Others relied more on secrecy than bribery, and would visit the cemeteries during the day and sprinkle ground up glass on top of the fresh graves, so that when they came back at night, the glass would glint in the lantern light or the moonlight, and they could get to work. In order to retrieve the bodies, they would dig down at the head of the grave and smash open the coffin lid. They would then send someone down, often a child, because practically the hole didn't need to be as big, to loop a rope either round the neck or under the arms of the corpse, whereby the rest would haul the body out and cover the grave as if nothing had happened. After all, no one would blink twice at the disturbed dirt on a recent burial. Now, a good body could go for up to £22 in 1830, which is about £2,000. But some extraordinary bodies, such as that of Charles Byrne, the Irish giant, who stood at 7'7", sold for £500 in 1783. Byrne features at some point in this presentation, so keep an eye out for him. Whilst I'm sure we will all agree the act is reprehensible, morally despicable, and yet it was totally legal. There was a weird grey area in the law at this time. Once you had died, your body was deemed worthless in the eyes of the law, regardless of its importance in the eyes of the church. It is here that there perhaps needs to be some clarification between body snatchers and grave robbers, descriptors that I've seen being used interchangeably, even though there were key differences. Grave robbers exhumed corpses with the express purpose of stealing things of value: gold, shoes, clothes, even gold crowns off your teeth. This was theft and was very much illegal and carried significant punishment. In comparison, because the body had no value, even though it sold for a significant price, it couldn't belong to the heirs. There was no crime being committed, and there was only a minor misdemeanor for trespassing on private property. So you had instances where grave robbers who were caught trespassing in graveyards at night simply claimed to be body snatchers in order to escape harsher punishment. Whilst they may have escaped the book being thrown at them by the courts, the punishment would have been dealt swiftly and thoroughly out by that community. Both grave robbers and body snatchers were despised and reviled, as rightly they should be. The level of body snatching in every experience was inherently tied to the number of medical schools. In places such as Glasgow and Edinburgh, which had an abundance of medical schools, they became synonymous with the practice, as the bodies could be dug up and offloaded at their destination with relative ease. In comparison, Belfast had only one medical school during this period and was located at Belfast Academical Institution, now known as RBAI. As an alumni of the school myself, I remember being told by the school prefects on my first day of skeletons being discovered on the site of the school whenever they were building the sixth form centre. Now, having studied this, I know the presence of the medical college attached to the school during its founding accounts for those remains. It is little comfort to the 12-year-old me with an active imagination who conjured up stories of disruptive students who never quite made it home. As Belfast only had one medical school, the demand for bodies in the immediate area was significantly lower. Such restrictions didn't deter would-be body snatchers in Ireland, however. Instead, they established one of the world's grisliest export businesses and shipped the dead bodies across the channel to places like Scotland and England, or even down to Dublin. There's a great story about a body that ended up in Warrington, which we'll come to shortly, but for the meantime, I want to focus on evidence we have here from Belfast. In 2002, building work was due to take place on the corner of Waring Street and Hill Street. That's maybe 2 streets beyond the cathedral on your way back into town. During excavations, archaeologists found the usual Victorian rubbish: pipe stems, glass bottles, but they also found this skull. What makes it interesting is you can clearly see evidence of a procedure called trepanning or trepanning. This involved drilling a hole in the skull to relieve pressure. It's clear from the number of the holes in the skull that this was used as practice post-mortem. Further research into street directories also showed that several physicians and doctors lived on this street during the 1800s. And whilst we have no way of knowing who the skull belonged to or how it came to be in the possession of a practicing doctor, there's a real possibility that it could have been part of a body that was stolen from one of the cemeteries nearby, as the doctors would have lived on the site during a period when body snatching would have been particularly prolific. Now, going up the road to Clifton Street Cemetery, or the New Burying Ground, as it was known, evidence of body snatching as recorded in the records of Belfast Charitable Society is surprisingly sparse. There's only one instance of body snatching that is recorded and named in the minute book. The event occurred on the 12th of January 1824, and the quote on the screen now was sent to the Belfast newsletter on the 20th. A reward of £50 is offered by the committee of the Belfast Charitable Society to any person who shall, within 6 weeks, give information to the steward against and prosecute to conviction the person or persons guilty of the atrocious offence of entering the burying ground behind the poorhouse on Monday night, 12th instance, and raising an infant's coffin several years interred. It remained unopened on the ground. Now, £50 was a lot of money in 1824, over £4,000, and that was near double the amount that bodies were selling for. Now, whilst this may be a disappointment to some of you who came expecting to hear juicy details of people wandering down Clifton Street to the docks with someone's deceased relative, ultimately, we have no way of knowing how many bodies were actually taken. This recorded instance was clearly one of an amateur, having dug up a body that was of no use in abandoning their work. Experienced body snatchers, on the other hand, would have left minimal trace, and the Charitable Society and Clifton Street Cemetery needed to prepare. There were many deterrents to body snatching that were employed, not only in Clifton Street Cemetery, but across Britain and Ireland. These were usually only afforded by the rich and wealthy. Mausoleums such as this one, built by the Dunville family, was not only an impressive monument, it also kept the graves of their deceased relatives safe. Other methods, such as this coffin guard, helped make exhuming the coffin much more difficult by making it significantly heavier and harder to break into. This coffin guard was actually found in the cemetery in the late 1800s and is now with National Museums Northern Ireland. Now, a deterrent that is unique to Clifton Street Cemetery was actually the presence of the Belfast Charitable Society itself. As we saw on the previous slide, they were intent on pursuing any body snatching that desecrated their cemetery. This is because the cemetery was tied to the Charitable Society's reputation. The society operated as a way to make money, yes, but it also provided the poorest people in Belfast a place to bury their dead. Any activity or incidents that took place in the cemetery would negatively reflect on the society. By publicly pursuing body snatchers, the society protected an important business asset which helped pay for the running of the very building in which this talk is taking place today, but also gave a level of protection to the poorest and most vulnerable people in the cemetery, who otherwise would have presented the easiest target. Now, Belfast Charitable Society was not just reactive to instances of body snatching, they were also proactive, as in 1832, they employed watchmen to look after the cemetery at night. The first watchman was selected through a vote and were called Hans Stevenson and Charles Miller. In the minutes of their appointment, the society also sought to cover some of their salary by charging each burial 10 shillings, as it was specifically these burials that the watchmen would protect. Their tenure would last until September 1832, when the Charitable Society took out an advertisement to notify the people of Belfast that they were discontinuing the watchmen. In this announcement, the society were very candid about their rationale. The public were refusing to pay. In the society's words, they were refusing to pay their trifling proportion. They also specify that they cannot allow the more ad hoc system that came before, where individuals hired their own personal watchmen or took it upon themselves. They stated it was both inefficacious of the purpose and productive of so much irregularity and immorality that it would be totally unjustifiable to allow it to be adopted again. This statement offers a glimpse into the reality faced by the society regarding the burying ground at this time. Not only were they concerned about the people stealing the dead, they also had to be concerned with the actions of the living. This absence didn't last long, as less than 4 months later, the society was looking to hire new watchmen. This came about due to circumstances that occurred within the cemetery. There's no elaboration on that fact. However, based on what we've covered so far, it can be narrowed down to the problems with the dead leaving it or the living entering it. The society hired 4 watchmen: John McIlwain, James McFarlane, Peter Rowan, and Hugh Kilpatrick. 2 of these watchmen would remain employed until March 1834. The other 2, McIlwain and McFarlane, had a much shorter tenure. On February 27, 1833, a meeting of the board of the Charitable Society was called to discuss an incident that occurred in the new burying ground on Monday the 25th. 2 soldiers from the 80th Regiment of Foot, or the Staffordshire Volunteers, reported that shots had been fired at the Victoria Barracks from the nearby cemetery. with some shots shattering a window in the room where the soldiers were sleeping. In total, 6 shots were reported to have struck the barracks, with the first striking the centre pane of a window at 12:30 a.m. The 2 watchmen on duty, McElwain and McFarland, were dismissed of their duties. The remaining watchmen were begrudgingly given back the rifles, but provided only with blank cartridges. Whilst body snatching and other unruly activities associated with the practice occurred across Britain and Ireland, this incident is by far the most unique to the new burying ground and is exclusive to the Belfast Charitable Society. It is still told on tours today that the rifle on display downstairs was the exact one that was used to protect the cemetery, and that one morning soldiers marched to the powerhouse and demanded to know why the Charitable Society had declared war on the British Army in the middle of the night. Now, we'll turn to more, if you pardon the pun, grave matters. There were some, I was expecting more of a reaction to that. There were some individuals who looked at body snatching and thought it sounded all a bit too much like hard work, getting up in the middle of the night in the cold winter night and digging through the frozen earth to reach their quarry. So they decided to acquire their bodies in a different way, by killing people and selling them on. 2 of the people on the slide may be familiar to you: Burke and Hare, individuals who have gone down in history as 2 of Britain's most infamous serial killers. Over a 10-month span in 1828, they murdered 16 people and sold their bodies to the same doctor, Dr. Robert Knox. Each body netted the duo a total of £8. It goes without saying, unlike body snatching, murder was in fact very illegal. Their crimes were eventually uncovered, and Burke would be sent to the gallows, where he would be hanged before being dissected himself, and the act of murdering someone with the intent to sell the body became known as burking. The group below may be less familiar. They were the Bethnal Green Gang, otherwise known as the London Burker Gang. They were active a little bit later than Burke and Hare in 1831. They were made up of 4 men: John Bishop, Thomas Williams, Michael Shields, and James May. Not that one. The 4 men were responsible for exhuming and selling 500 to 1,000 bodies over a 12-year stretch. However, Bishop and Williams took it a step further and murdered 4 people with the intention of selling their bodies to the medical facilities. Shields was not incriminated, and May was spared the gallows, but was transported to what is now Tasmania, where he died 3 years later and was buried in an unmarked grave on the Isle of the Dead, which seems somewhat ironic for a prolific body snatcher. There was immense public appetite to find out more about these burkers. After the arrest of Bishop, Williams, and May, the police opened up their house in which the murders took place to the public and charged 5 shillings a visit. Bishop and Williams were hanged in front of a crowd of thousands. Likewise, for Burke's execution in 1829, nearly 25,000 people came to watch, with people offering access to their overlooking windows for a small fee, as can be seen in this picture. After their executions, their bodies found their way into the same medical theatres as their victims, as they were dissected in the name of science. Burke's skeletal remains are still on display in the Museum of Anatomy in Edinburgh, alongside his death mask in his bottom right, as well as a pocketbook that is bound in his tanned skin. Not wanting to be left out, there was, of course, burking in Ulster. One of my favourites, if I can say that in reference to a murder case, is the case of Charles and Agnes Clark from my neck of the woods in Drumbo, who murdered Daniel McConnell. Now, I first found this story in a paper written by the Emeritus Professor at Queen's, Alan Evans, who I believe is also the current president of the Belfast Natural History and Philosophical Society. And rather than me mangling his words, I'll just read you what he wrote about it. A case of burking in Ulster took place in Ballylesson, County Down, in January 1831. Charles and Agnes Clark of Jumbo were tried for the murder of an unknown person and Daniel McConnell, whom they had entrapped with the pretense of hospitality. Agnes Clark then tried to sell McConnell's body to a surgeon at Antrim Infirmary, who then raised the alarm. Quite how she proposed to market a body with multiple hatchet wounds to the head is unclear, but she claimed that the death was the result of a stone quarry falling. As directed by the judge, their bodies were dissected, and in April 1836, casts of their skull were donated to the Belfast Natural History Society. The fascination with Birking reveals a level of morbid curiosity that came to characterize much of the 1800s. From people flocking to see infamous criminals be hanged, the fascination and fixation on murders and serial killers such as Jack the Ripper in 1888, or the striped circus tents of P.T. Barnum's Victorian freak shows. Whilst a lot has changed since the 19th century, these stories of the macabre still prove intriguing and interesting to us. After all, you braved the November weather and Belfast traffic to be here tonight. The stories surrounding body snatching also offered an insight into a phenomenon that we have become all too accustomed to in the digital era of 24-hour reporting cycles: fake news. With the public appetite for news of body snatching, including all the juicy details, newspapers began stretching the truth somewhat. Because body snatching was a clandestine practice, there was practically no paper trail, no clear-cut understanding of what happened. There was no baseline or benchmark for the public to gauge the goings-on during the night, so they relied on the newspapers of the day to glean a bit of a better understanding. Some newspapers, such as the Northern Whig, were prolific publishers of body snatching stories that seemed to adhere to the old adage, don't let facts get in the way of a good story. One particular story was actually the catalyst of me starting this journey down this rather odd rabbit hole. On a tour of the cemetery, our guide retold the story of a John Fairclough from 1828. He was buried on a Thursday in Clifton Street Cemetery, but then turned up in Warrington in England on the Sunday, having been transported there in a barrel marked spiced pork. With all this information, name, date of death, the link to the cemetery and the charitable society, I was certain that I would be able to find out more about this man and his posthumous journey. Nope, not a single shred of evidence for this man that this man ever existed. No death certificate, no newspaper coverage in contemporary newspapers, no plot or burial listing, and not a mention about a John Fairclough or any high-profile body snatching incident in the board minutes either. Until I came across a legal case that was reported in the Liverpool Albion from 1828, the King versus Davis, in which the body of a Jane Fairclough was discovered at the house of a Dr. Moss, who was a physician in Warrington. Jane had died aged 24 and was buried in Hills Cliff Burial Ground on the Friday before the grave was discovered and as disturbed on the following Monday, before being discovered at Dr. Moss's house on the Tuesday. Davis, who was an apprentice at the dispensary, was fined for his role in the body snatching, a first for Britain, as it was the first time a medical personnel was held accountable. The story had been adopted, some facts changed, and then passed off as a local story to help shift sales. Now, on a brief side note, the story was very reminiscent to me of the nursery rhyme about Solomon Grundy, born on a Monday, christened on a Tuesday, etc., except buried on a Thursday, snatched on a Friday, shipped on a Saturday, and discovered on the Sunday. While this comparison was meant to be in jest, I found that the nursery rhyme was first recorded in the 1840s, which again highlights the morbidity of the period. The story of John Fairclough highlights the issues that academics have in verifying instances of body snatching. The secretive nature of body snatching, coupled with the public appetite for hearing about it, left it an ideal stomping ground for journalists willing to stretch the truth. These stories resulted in a public familiar with every reported detail, accurate or not, taking it upon themselves to protect their loved ones' remains. As previously highlighted, these vigilantes proved a nuisance to the charitable society, and we can see how there is a potential link between major events in the news and a need to take control of situations in the new burying ground. The London Burqa Gang were tried and executed in December of 1831. The first watchman hired in the burying ground 1 month later in January 1832. We already know from the minutes that immorality was occurring in the cemetery as a result of these unpaid watchmen, and an extract from the Northern Whig further highlights that it may have been the need to regulate the unruly living as much as it was the wandering dead. In consequence of those persons lately interred in the poorhouse burying ground, having been in the habit of firing guns charged with slugs and bullets, which sometimes alarmed the neighbours and passengers and also injured the tombs and headstones, the poorhouse committee lately came to a resolution that they would employ 2 responsible persons. They will be well armed and will have watchdogs with them constantly. In the lifespan of body snatching, 1832 was late in the day to be implementing prevention strategies, as it's the same year that the Anatomy Act was passed. This act was meant to put an end to body snatching once and for all. The Anatomy Act opened up alternative pathways for doctors to acquire bodies for dissection. What had previously been a single method was expanded with the hope that an increased supply would render the body snatching, and more importantly, the burking, obsolete. It had, however, a number of flaws and proved unpopular amongst public and politicians alike. The legitimate methods were expanded from just the bodies of condemned criminals to include unclaimed bodies from morgues and workhouses, as well as offering the ability for people to donate their bodies to science. Whilst improving supply seems fine in principle, it was ironically the execution, no pun intended, that resulted in the act being deeply unpopular, as people saw it as the government equating the poor and needy who looked to the workhouse as a last resort as equal in the eyes of the governing as the worst criminals. Anti-anatomy protests took place almost immediately in objection for the bill, with some questioning why doctors and scientists were being indulged to such a degree at the expense of the country's poorest and most vulnerable. People such as this man, William Cobbett, who was a member of the Radicals Party, an early precursor to the Lib Dems, who was a staunch critic of the act, stating, "They tell us it was necessary for science. Science? Why? Who is the science for? Not for poor people. Then, if it is necessary for science, let them have the bodies of the rich, for whose benefit science is cultivated." Now, during this period, doctors and scientists were not in the good graces of the public. They had been in cahoots with the morally depraved body snatchers and burkers, all in the pursuit of knowledge that was frowned upon by the church and questioned long-standing traditions of, if I'm being flippant, leeches, popery, and questionable concoctions. In fairness to Cobbett, it didn't help that some doctors presented themselves in quite a cartoon villain type of way. Take, for example, Dr. John Hunter, Scottish surgeon and an important figure in medical history. In his portrait, just behind Dr. Hunter, you can just about make out some feet. Those are the remains of Charles Byrne, the body of whom, if you recall from the beginning of the lecture, John Hunter had bribed and bartered for. Here it is on display, not necessarily in a museum, but in his office. The body would actually be displayed in the museum until 2020, until it was removed on protest of distant relatives. It was displayed not for scientific benefit, but as an oddity attraction. So, as you can see, those in the medical profession were not beloved in their community. People assumed they were hell-bent on the pursuit of knowledge, committing crimes against God, common decency, and the law to further their curiosity, which rather handily brings me back to the rhetorical question I posed at the very start of the lecture. What do Mary Shelley and Spencer Perceval have in common? Of course, we established early on, I think it was John Bellingham. You see, after Bellingham's execution, his body was given to be dissected in the Royal College of Surgeons. During this time, there was significant fascination with the use of electricity and the reanimation of the dead. I can see on a couple of faces that connection just clicked. Great success was achieved during Bellingham's dissection, as they explored how long a heart could be made to move after death. In this instance, Bellingham's heart continued to beat for nearly 4 hours. While we can't be sure if it was this exact dissection in 1812 or one of the others during this period that may have inspired Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in 1818, I cannot think of a better analogy on which to end that best encapsulates the prevailing feeling of the time. The Mad Doctor and the Misunderstood Creation, a Gothic tale, much like the stories of body snatchers, still enduring the test of time, but could only really be a product of the early 19th century. Thank you.
Well done, James. That was splendid. Really, and such research that you've undertaken, especially finding a Fairclough explanation. I think that's real detective work. As for any doctors in the room, well, we all have a new picture, but not of the present day medical profession, of course. Now, are there any questions that anyone in the room would like to ask?
Does that mean there's a lot of empty graves on some of them?
Almost certainly. I wouldn't be able to stand up there and say for certain how much body snatching occurred. What's quite unique about Clifton Street Cemetery in particular is that it saw a lot of damage in the 1970s, which also caused many graves to be disrupted. So even if we were to undertake like an archaeological survey or a ground survey, we wouldn't even be able to tell whether or not the bodies had been taken in the 1830s or they were much more recently taken in the sort of 1970s, whenever that area was a bit of a battleground.
I'm sure it won't be long before there's a drone that will be able to fly over and tell you how many empty graves there might be. Of course, the grave holds many bodies. James, tell us, can you, how many? I know there's a cholera pit there, and it was reopened after the famine fevers. And not only the great and the good are buried in their great mausoleums, but the poor are buried in with less ceremony, perhaps.
Yeah, I think Lauren might be able to correct me in this, but there's certainly around about, is it around about 1,000, or is there more than that in the famine pit? I'm putting you on the spot here now.
So if there's, I think it could be more than that.
Yeah.
Not double, because we had the 1832 cholera pandemic, and as Ronnie said, and the pits had to be because of the famine, because of workhouse spread around the numbers.
Yeah. One thing that I did discover during my research, that during the famine in particular, before the famine, the Charitable Society used to give out coffins, basically to provide the poor of Belfast. And I think it was 1847 that they basically said that they couldn't even keep up with the demand of that, and they had to stop giving out coffins to the people of Belfast. And they never resumed after that because it just overwhelmed the society, basically, the demand and the need during Belfast's darkest time.
The register of burials didn't begin until the 1830s, but there's been some research on the records of burials from before that time, not registered. And you'll see the table downstairs if you've looked in the corridor to the side. 600 or something names are there, ranging from 90-year-olds to 3-year-olds. Very sad catalogue, but there were people who died in a home because at that time, in the 1840s, there were 450 people resident in this house. It wasn't as extensive as it is now. So that must mean there were 6 in a bed or whatever it required. But it was a very crowded place, and half of them were children. Half of them were adults. Now, anyone else like to ask anything? Yes, Lauren.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk. I definitely learned a lot from it. I'm probably picking your brain tomorrow at 8:30 in the morning. So no, I was wanting to ask more about the media frenzy. So you know the way you were saying more about that she generated a lot of stories, like made a lot of stories to generate and tell stories. Do you think this is in response because there was hardly any news about Clifton Street Cemetery having body snatching cases because it was such a secret crime?
Again, it's one of those ones, because of the nature of the practice, I don't want to stand up here and stake like my academic reputation on it. From what I saw, it was largely whenever there was a significant case going on, that there was like a rise in interest to the public, and they would try and capitalize on that. And it's part of the reason, I know from discussing with some people in this room, today when I was researching that the Anatomy Act, some people think it was a dead stop. No, again, no, I keep on straying into pun territory, but that it was the end of body snatching. But there were so many logistics to work out in terms of the backlog that was already there. I think majorly it sort of killed the interest in it. It was old news by the time that something had been done, and people weren't sort of raving about it anymore, which is why we stopped hearing about it. But in the earlier stages, in 1828, whenever there was that Rexby Davis case, in 1831 and 32, when there was the London Burqa case, suddenly news was everywhere. People were concerned, and you even saw how quickly people lost interest in paying 10 shillings. All of a sudden, whenever people were greeted with an opportunity to make sure their relatives were safe for a small financial fee, they were like, that's fine, but actually, nah, it's old news now. It did seem to be the early sort of peaks and troughs of the news cycle almost.
Yes. I'm sorry, can I ask you, and then?
James, the photograph you showed us of the fragment of skull that was produced from the excavations, which showed the hallmarks of trepanning. Presumably, all these burr holes that were done in the skull were done by students practicing the art so that they could then take it on to use in real life, as it were.
Yeah.
In live patients.
Yes, exactly. And I think there's a modern version of it, I think, that is still occasionally, I think it's called burring or something along those lines. It does kind of show that even though it looks really barbaric, sometimes we really don't have an alternative for some things that are required. But just based on the number of holes in the skull, there's no way that that it would be anything other than practice. And there was actually a fragment of the skull had been pushed in because 3 holes had been too close together. And there was another one, if I can actually just quickly borrow the clicker. David, can you click? Sure. If we go back to the skull in question, and I realize how many slides I have, you can see that they're also at varying depths, which kind of suggests a bit of trial and error. I definitely wouldn't suggest that it's by any means some sort of backyard surgery attempt that may have gone awry, because there would have been more bones. They wouldn't have just sort of taken the head with them and left the rest behind. But yeah, it was almost certainly a practicing physician.
But bearing in mind, though, that this would have had to have been carried out without the use of anaesthetic.
Yes.
This was pre-anaesthetic era, so medicine as a whole was a pretty barbaric occupation.
100%.
This gentleman here had a question.
Sorry, I was just wondering, the 10 shillings, it was a one-off payment, and what would it be in today's value, anyways?
Ooh.
I reckon we were talking roughly about 3.5 away from the crowd.
I'm not quite sure, to be honest with you. This is betraying my sort of young age, as it were, because I don't even know how the denomination of old money, as it were, sort of breaks down. I couldn't honestly tell you off the top of my head. I wouldn't imagine based on the Charitable Society's message, as it were, and their sort of outlook, I couldn't imagine it would be, bankrupting. Did you?
About 1,400 pounds.
Serious? Well, there you go. We learned something new. Clearly, that was only meant for. Was that seriously in 1830?
Yeah.
10 shillings?
Money converters quite close, you can actually put in the coin and then it
I don't know who they expected to pay what they called a trifling proportion, but I'll have to go back and double check that. Perhaps I got the denomination wrong, but
It could be 1,400 pounds, because it was £8 per body, and he reckons £2,000 in today's money. So 10 shillings would work out that would be. It had to be, what, 3.5 to £500. Still a substantial sum.
Yeah. I'll definitely go back into the archives and just double check, because I may have misread the handwriting in the minute books. Because it seems weird that they would call it a trifling proportion and then expect someone to pay an arm and a leg. But certainly it would only be a one-off payment, just because the bodies were only usable perhaps at most 2 weeks after death, depending on the weather. So it would have been a one-off payment and would have been rotated to the next burial. But I'll go back and double check that. I may have just misread the unit.
I think you also need to bear in mind who's being buried in that burial ground, because it's meant to be for the elite and the wealthy.
True.
And industrialists who probably could afford that amount.
Although they could also afford to pay for their own private, like the mausoleums or the coffin cage. True.
So they're just basically
Yeah.
lots, so they will need
Yeah.
protection as well.
Well, if you're old enough like myself, you know that 10 shillings is 50p. So it is a today it's a trifling,
Yeah.
trifling amount. I don't know how that measures up. Now, any other questions? Yes, the lady in the corner.
So that's necessarily about body snatching and grave robbing as a whole, but it's more of like the kind of structures of the graves and stuff like, as you mentioned, the coffin guards, and the work guards. Obviously, there is obviously in like England and stuff, there you kind of fear about being buried alive with bells and stuff, and then obviously we have the legend of Martin Call and everything here. How common was that in the likes of Clifton Street Cemetery and around Belfast?
In terms of the alterations of the graves to allow the whole Saved by the Bell thing is quite interesting, because there seems to be a version of it in every sort of country. I know there's ones in America as well, and I don't think it was practically done a lot, but it did speak to the sort of base fear and that the close association that we seem to have with dying and death, particularly in that period. There were
33 points. Sorry.
Right. It's slightly more reasonable, but still quite a lot. But in Scotland, for example, the alterations to the graves were more so just different ways of fitting the coffin guard. That one would have been sort of a more basic one compared to the ones you perhaps would see in Edinburgh. I think Greyfriars Kirk, they have a fairly significant steel cage almost that went around the coffin. But in terms of ones that sort of related to particular fears, there was stories of booby trapping coffins, for example. I think someone, I can't remember who it was telling me the story that they sort of spring loaded the shotgun in the coffin, for example. But again, no evidence of that survives, and much like the story of the Saved by the Bell, that is what we have left that sort of passes down rather than the physical evidence, which makes it much more difficult for the academics to sort of stand by it, but it is very good for adding colour into the presentations surrounding the facts.
I don't know if you saw that, but £33 is the 50p price. Perhaps they thought it was £10 earlier, not 10 shillings. Was there someone here who went? Yes, this lady here.
Your thing was the food and what was the plan following that?
Was it late 20th century was the last burial? Because I think there was a special
There was a special act in 1927, so there was a family plot, and I really want to be buried in the family mausoleum Institute for that one to be London.
27.
When was it generally through to?
In the 1880s, I think they stopped burials from those who were not in the poorhouse, for those who were in the poorhouse, and family graves. The original scheme was a fundraiser, of course, because they set the ground aside and sold the graves, so that was meant to raise money for the charitable society. But yes, that filled up in the late 19th century. So then they modified it, and as Lauren was saying, the final thing came well, that'll be 50 years later. There are tours of the graveyard if you wish to go, and you see some famous names, and it holds the graves of Mary Ann and Henry Joy McCracken. Whether Henry Joy McCracken is actually buried there is a matter of some debate, but bones were placed in the grave with Mary Ann some time ago, which may have been his bones recovered from the graveyard at the St. George's. Now, any further questions that anyone would like to raise? And was there a chat? I've checked this. Thank you to Brona for checking for us. And £10 is 678, but still not a huge amount. Thank you. That's very good. Well, if that's everything, thank you very much. If you could show your appreciation to James. Thank you. Now, just a few closing remarks, because I want to mention one or two events that are coming up. There'll be another talk here on the 18th of November. That's next week, is it? Yes, next Monday. Belfast Deaf Communities, and there's a talk on that evening. And then Sunday, the 8th of December, Victorian Crafty Christmas. There'll be a special event. If you'd like to come for an early Christmas. And then Christmas House Tours. I think they're on your sheet about the Christmas House Tours, which are the weekend of the 13th, 14th December and the weekend of 2021 December. So please continue your support. Also, if you know anyone else who'd like to make a donation, please invite them to do so. There's also a book which has been published to commemorate the 250th anniversary, and it's got lots of facts and figures about this. And there's some copies on the shelf at the back. And if you'd like to take one, there's no charge. But if you'd like to give them to someone who's wealthy and would make a donation to the charity, we would be very grateful. And thank you very much for that. Finally, there's an evaluation form. And if you wouldn't mind taking the time to fill in the evaluation form, we'd be very grateful. Thank you all very much for attending.